We are the best kept secret in the universe. Our mission is to monitor extraterrestrial activity on Earth. We are your best, last, and only line of defense. We work in secret. We exist in shadow.
And we dress in black.
Welcome. Now, you may be wondering, thank you. Now, you may be wondering why we had Men in Black to begin our session. For those of you living under a rock or you haven't checked the program, we're actually competing with Will Smith, who's giving a session right now. I hope you're not all running out now. So we figured we're very grateful that you chose us over Will Smith. But interestingly, two things. One, he's talking about concussion, which is a brain disorder issue. But also, I don't know if you know this, but actually before psychiatrists were called psychiatrists, they were actually called alienists. So actually we have a lot in common with the Men in Black. And today we thought, it was, Arsha actually works, one of the many things he does is work for an augmented reality company. So you're an augmented reality expert, right, Arsha?
I try to be.
Okay, so we thought we were going to actually launch this later in the year in October, but we thought, we had the prototypes ready, so we would launch a new product. Now, the first day, yesterday, we saw virtual reality, okay? This product is not virtual reality, right?
And it's not augmented reality.
So, as you can see, they're a little bit clunky. It's 1.0, the first one, right? But this is beyond virtual reality and it's beyond augmented reality. This is RR. Anyone heard of RR? So this, you can take it home, you can say, I saw RR for the first time at the meeting. This is reality. So that's what the next step is, it's the next augmentation. So we're going to talk about really some real issues that people face in mental health, like Jill said. And to do that, I've asked Arsha to actually maybe talk us through some slides about what does the landscape look like, where are we at? So Arsha, if you want to take that.
Great, thank you. Can we advance the slide? So we've actually had pretty enormous growth in the number of startups and commercial companies focusing on mental health. This growth has actually become more rapid recently and has been accompanied by an uptick in investment. This is very much a hot space at the moment. Can we go to the next slide? One of the things that we're seeing is that not only are we having more companies, but they're covering an increasing amount of areas. We have companies that are covering telehealth. We have companies that are looking at big data analytics, producing provider platforms. We have some emerging companies looking at augmented and virtual reality solutions for mental health. And one of the things that we know compared to about a year ago is that not only are there more companies, but there's more overlap. More companies are trying to build products that are covering more of these segments. Thank you. Over to you.
Great. So now, some of you may have been at ASCO end of this week, or some of our colleagues are already still there. Now, oncology has been very trendy recently, right? Lots of investment. I truly believe that when it comes to digital health, the biggest impact digital will have is actually in behavior and motivation. So it goes beyond just mental health. I think by having the key on how to do that, we will absolutely impact disorders across the spectrum, not just mental illness. So that's why I feel very excited about the potential of digital in ways that people have never thought about. I know Arsha is the lead author on a paper we're publishing in my journal about how do we actually prevent the epidemic of suicide digitally, which sounds kind of crazy. When I first talked about it with Arsha, I'm like, can we do a whole paper on this? And actually, it's really interesting how one might think about that. So I think everything we do, whether it's in clinical care or drug development, can absolutely be changed for the better by using digital technologies. And I'm really excited to have the group that we have on stage with us, because I truly believe they are changing the landscape. So I'm very proud of who we have here, and we're going to get them to come on board, right?
Sure. I think there's just one more point that I want to make that highlights how important technology and innovation is going to be in this space. When we say depression, many people think of depression as just being one thing. Are people depressed, yes or no, a categorical entity. But did you know that there's 126 different symptom combinations that can result in a diagnosis of depression. 126. So you can have several people who are diagnosed with depression, but actually have very little overlap in their symptoms. And that's where data science and innovation and technology can help us redefine and reconceptualize not only diagnosis and treatment, but actually the conditions themselves.
So I think that applies actually to more than depression. Like, if I'll give you another example, you can have two patients diagnosed with schizophrenia that do not have a single symptom in common. Now think about that compared to other disorders. So clearly we have a long way to go to understand the pathophysiology, the phenotype, right? And I think this is where data science is going to come in. And I think because we haven't had these keys before to how the brain works, this is why 7 years ago the large pharmaceutical companies left in long ways sort of neuroscience. A famous quote from one CEO was, "The brain is just too hard." You know, so we're hoping that as we go forward with our knowledge, that really the brain will come a little bit easier to understand, and we can leverage that across the therapeutic areas. Great, I think it's time we brought on our experts. So Arsha's feeling very fidgety. He's going to be on a flight later today, so he said that we're going to stand up, okay, instead of sitting down. So we're going to have the speakers actually be sitting, and we're going to interrogate them, apparently.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you, pleasure.
And I know Alejandro is much more attractive than I am, but I'll be replacing him today. So.
That's debatable, but okay. We also have Adam Hanina, who actually has an incredible product. I think he's running late, but he'll join the session. So Arsha, if you want to start maybe.
Sure. So I wanted all of you to kind of step by step tell us a little bit about yourselves and a little bit about your company. So maybe we'll start with you, Thomas.
Sure. So I'm Thomas Getz. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Iodine. We're just a couple blocks away from here, and our premise is we help people find what works, specifically what works, what medications work for them. We're grappling with the problem of what we call the mess of medicine, the kind of problematic hit rate of most medications. And medication therapy works great, but it takes a lot of trial and error, a lot of failure. And so we're creating kind of consumer-oriented experiences through web and mobile that really help people work through the process and help their provider work through the process as quickly as possible to basically find what works. And that involves a lot of data. My co-founder, Matt Mohebi, is a former Google developer. And so we're really creating what we believe is one of the largest databases of personal experience around these medications and the therapies.
And it's a website and an app.
Yep.
And if someone logs in, they can see the kind of patient-led data.
Exactly, yeah, it's really driven through the patient-reported experience. That's our unique data set. And so it's kind of present and visible throughout the whole thing. RCTs are great. We believe that there's a whole lot of value that RCTs create, but in some ways they are the best of all possible worlds.
So when you say RCT...
Oh, I'm sorry, randomized clinical trials. And that's kind of wonderful to kind of have that gold standard of evidence in the approval of drugs, but in the actual use and kind of how we use the medicine cabinet, that gets a little messier, and the hit rate isn't nearly so good.
So one of the reasons you're here is because Iodine is a game changer. Can you, in a couple of sentences, say why are you a game changer?
Okay, well, I think basically the scale of the data and the way. So we already have data around in terms of mental health. We have a data set that would rival the largest clinical trials ever conducted around medications and depression, and really the ability to, like, exactly as you were saying, the kind of the multi-dimensional aspects of these conditions. You know, we can understand already. We have good predictive signals on which symptomology in the first week of starting a new antidepressant, how well those correlate to 6-week or 12-week outcomes, and so and as well as teasing out the kind of dimensions of how different triggers for depression might indicate different symptomology and different courses of most effective treatment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
So Tom, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
So I think most of us know who Tom is, right? So I'm fascinated. You've led at Wired magazine, right? You've done lots of interesting things in the past. Now, when you were at Wired, you must have seen some cool tech every month looking at. So it's really amazing to me why mental health, why this approach. Out of all the things that you saw, I'm fascinated to know why that. What did you choose that? It's the one thing you're going to jump into.
Right. Well, so technology is wonderful, and it has many dimensions to it that I think are remarkable. I think in health and medicine, and I had a chance to go and get my master's in public health in the middle of my journalistic career, and so that really was a exposure to me on the complexity and the opportunity just to make the day-to-day practice of medicine greater or more efficient. There's a great kind of people get very enamored and romance around the future of medicine and kind of the romance of genetics and biomarkers and all these things. That's great. I'm glad people are working on those things. But there's a day-to-day reality that we could just make the system much more effective through the use of information technologies and really bring benefit to people's lives in the day-to-day right now. And so that's what I am passionate about and what I think we're trying to do.
Thank you. I'll take Corey next, if that's okay. So, Corey, maybe tell the audience a little bit about your background and what Pear Therapeutics is and why you think you're a game changer.
Sure, absolutely. So, Corey McCann here. I'm the CEO of Pear Therapeutics. I guess by way of a brief personal introduction, I'm originally trained as a physician neuroscientist, was a pharma investor thereafter, and I think really what makes Pear different is that we look at digital health and specifically digital therapeutics really through the lens of a drug developer. And so for us, that means RCTs, and again, randomized clinical trials. We develop these digital products across existing approvable endpoints, in many cases comparing standard of care to the digital therapy, all along really gearing ourselves for FDA submission. And so why are we exciting? We're on pace to have the first FDA-approved patient-facing digital therapy. You can say certainly much, much more about that. But again, I think Thomas provided a really nice jumping-off point. I think we think a lot about RCTs. We run a lot of RCTs. That's the gold standard for us. And again, this is really about transitioning from a digital health service, which is, I think, most of what you've heard about today, to a digital health product. So something which has a unique reimbursement code, something which has claims, something which in some cases can be substituted for clinician intervention, and really sort of productizing digital health.
So maybe you can tell us a bit more about what does Pear mean by digital therapy, because that's a very broad term. Specifically for your company, what exactly is that?
Sure. So for us, these are basically patient-facing prescription apps. They're available only via script, and really what's different here is that we're all about treating disease. So we're not a health and wellness company, and in all cases, we go after sort of the thorniest, most difficult issues in mental health. So in our pipe, our lead program is in substance use disorder with a follow-on in opiate dependence, a product in schizophrenia thereafter, and a product in post-traumatic stress disorder, specifically related to combat stress. After that. And I think in all of these cases, again, we're going after what the FDA would deem a primary approvable endpoint. So just to give you a sense for sort of what this looks like, the pivotal that we submitted in substance use disorder was a 507-patient, 10-center RCT. Patients either got face-to-face therapy, best-of-breed face-to-face therapy, or the digital therapy, and the primary endpoint for the trial was twice-weekly urine drug screen. The high note is we doubled rates of abstinence versus face-to-face therapy. But again, we're not asking the FDA to think about new endpoints. We're really just asking the FDA to think about these digital therapies in the same way that they've been thinking about medical devices and pharmaceuticals for quite some time.
So you're really augmenting the pharmaceuticals with digital wraparounds, is that right?
First release is basically as a monotherapy, and everything else in the pipe is as a drug software combination. And the notion here is that everyone else at bio is very familiar with the concept of a reformulation. So in respiratory, for example, they've been taking existing dry powders, sticking them in new metered dose inhalers, and turning that into a new product with new regulatory exclusivity, new premium pricing, and really there's a whole established business model around that. What we're trying to do is basically in the very same way create a drug-device combination, except the device is a patient-facing digital therapy. That for us is the e-formulation platform. And we are pushing through a number of pharma collaborations down, and not to get too jargony here, but sort of a 505(b)(2) path to get new claims, really sort of turning the combinations into new regulated medicines.
So just to be clear, so I want to make sure everyone understands exactly some of the things you're doing. So you're taking mainly generic drugs, is that correct? And unlocking some value in terms of improved outcomes by having a digital wraparound it? Am I getting that right?
Absolutely, and I think just to speak to the numbers in our opiate dependence product, so that's a combination between our product Reset, which is a patient-facing digital therapy, and the approved medications for opiate dependence, either methadone and or buprenorphine. In those RCTs, we basically doubled rates of abstinence versus face-to-face plus buprenorphine, and face-to-face plus methadone.
Okay. Now, I'll have much more questions with Corey, but at the beginning, we're going to keep it short just to introduce the company. So you're next, Arsha.
Sure. So I'll move on to Nicholas from Lantern.
Yeah, so I come from a consumer tech background, and just kind of on the other side of Pear is our guiding light is that mental health is for everybody. And so we build very similar types of programs, but it's much more targeted towards subclinical populations. And so we have a stress and anxiety spectrum program and an eating disorder program, and working on a mood depression spectrum program to deliver digital therapeutics to kind of the larger population. We'll pass everyone off that's on the clinical side over to you guys, and we'll kind of try and say mental health is for everyone, and we'll take everybody else. But everybody did a pretty good intro onto a lot of the same topics, is that, you know, therapy has been kind of a area in which data has been lacking for a very long time, and bringing things into the digital realm allows us to collect very robust data sets and get to what you guys were talking about at the very beginning, which is, you know, every person that goes through a therapeutic process is very unique, and so how you tailor things to that individual and provide these services to much larger populations. So.
And at the same time, I know that you're partnering with a very large medical center, UPMC.
Yes. So we've entered a really great relationship with UPMC and are starting to get ingrained into their primary care, and like Lantern will be delivered in hospital in what part of the whole process when you go into any sort of primary care visit and you are exhibiting symptoms that are in the spectrums that we want to be helpful in. So if someone is, you know, in the more severe end of the spectrum, they'll definitely be referred to in-person therapy like normal, or perhaps to something like Pear. But then everyone else that is in that spectrum where there previously wasn't quite that referral space, Lantern is now being part of that process and being delivered to everyone else.
So, and the reason why I said that was, I understand there's a $17 million investment they made, so that's quite a sizable move in this space.
UPMC's made a big bet with us, and it's definitely one of the larger investments in the space, and we're, you know, really excited to start putting that to good use and start, like, as you see that graph that you showed earlier of the spaces heating up, we want to be at the forefront of that, and we want to use that money to help push this whole agenda forward. So.
Great, thank you so much.
So I think later in the conference we're going to have an on-demand session. I see that Adam is absolutely sort of embodying on-demand. He is here literally to within 2 seconds of when he was to go. Actually, my backup plan, Adam, was interesting because Adam has actually provided us a 1-minute video from his website you can look that shows what the product is. So if Adam wasn't here, I was going to say we're going to be very digital. We're actually going to have the video speak for him. Maybe we should do that to start with anyway. Does that make sense, Adam? To show, and I think you have the clicker if you click.
In an ideal world, all patients would take their medication as prescribed. That's why AI Cure is enabling the world's 2 billion smartphones with the intelligence to ensure they do. Our patented facial recognition and motion sensing technology automatically confirms medication ingestion. We make sure that the right patient is taking the right medication at the right time. Large biopharmaceutical clients are benefiting from higher adherence and more accurate data. Whether in clinical research or high-risk populations, new efficiencies and improved health outcomes are now possible. The interactive technology adapts to patient behavior and can be easily downloaded onto any mobile device. Improper use or suspicious activity triggers real-time intervention. There is no change to the manufacturing process. This means that the patient does not require any additional hardware and does not need to ingest anything other than the medication itself. With a portfolio of intellectual property and multiple innovation awards, AI Cure is transforming clinical research and the delivery of care with the potential to impact billions on a global scale. AI Cure, the definitive adherence solution.
So, we've asked everyone why they're game changers. What is interesting to me, if there's one category that I've seen more startups and certainly drug development world, is patient compliance and adherence to medication, right? So I know we've been working with you at Quintiles. Why do you think we did that? Why is it that you're different out of the hundreds of companies that tell us you can have a bottle you can open that tell you have all those other, featured sort of vendors. What is it that you guys do that's so different?
Well, first off, I really appreciate being here, but there are some things that even our artificial intelligence cannot predict, such as delays from Austin.
Yeah.
So apologies. But to answer your question, when you're trying to measure driving speed down the highway, it's difficult to rely on self-reported data. When people are asked to report their driving speed, it's going to be unreliable. And then suddenly, if they're trying to report their driving speed to the police, it's going to be even more unreliable. So you really have to have an accurate form to monitor medication adherence.
So we'll talk a bit more about with Tom later how reliable patient report is, right? We can talk about that. But so a couple of things it was mentioned in this video that I want to draw out, which I think kind of, to my mind, sort of differentiates you guys. One is when we first met quite a few years ago now, and your methodology is validated by multiple NIH grants, is that correct? How many of those have you had?
We've actually won over $7 million in NIH funding, and those grants are extremely competitive to get, typically awarded to about 3 to 5% of applicants. We've won grants from NIMH through an R01 with Department of Public Health in San Francisco and Emory University, and also through NCATS, National Center for Advancing Translational Science, and NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse.
And you've had major venture funding more recently as you've scaled up, correct?
That's correct. We recently raised $12.25 million financing led by New Leaf Venture Partners, as well as the former chief scientific advisor to Bill Gates, who sat on the Gates Foundation assessing new technologies that will have an impact on global health outcomes. And those investors that we've assembled are really a world-class investor base for us to both expand our commercial base, but also it's extremely validating to be able to attract that type of pedigree.
Yeah, so I think that probably is driven by the IP that the video mentioned. When you guys first told me about your IP, I was kind of skeptical, wasn't I? I said, really, you have that? So maybe you can explain what is exactly the IP that you have?
So one of the co-founders is actually a patent attorney. We have external validation from Fish & Richardson, who's our external IP law firm. They've done external vetting on the IP from an acquisition and litigation approach. We have over 17 patents issued and 55 applications pending. We've really made IP a core part of our strategy to protect core attributes of patient monitoring, and we have an extensive portfolio covering other types of tiers or foundational tiers beyond that.
So, but is your IP, if I'm understanding it, medication adherence through a device? That's your IP, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It's using software and devices. These are not business patents. These are system method patents across a wide range of patient monitoring activities using artificial intelligence.
Okay. Can you explain briefly the two segments, drug development needs and the clinical market needs? How are they different for you and the offering that you have? Why is it important in each case?
Sure, thank you. So right now, 80% of our activity is in clinical research, where we enable improved statistical power, because when you are able to show improved concentration levels according to of the medication in the blood, you can actually equate that to improved statistical power, and you prevent clinical trials from failing when patients are not taking the medication. So the discussion around that is quite simple, and that better quality data enables us to get drugs into the marketplace more quickly. On the population health side, we're working towards improving health outcomes by improving, again, medication adherence rates in high-risk patient populations. Think of medication adherence similar to driving speed. In clinical research, we're measuring what type of driving speed allows a car to go from A to B. But in population health, we're measuring when we need to intervene, when someone's swerving, when they're going too quickly or too slowly.
So just to be clear, some of you may not be involved in drug development. You may have seen, in the press, questions about, do antidepressants work, for instance. What's interesting and what the dirty little secret is, unfortunately, when we do clinical trials, and a remarkably high percentage of patients are not taking the medication at all. So it's kind of difficult to beat placebo when you're not taking your medication. So this is a critical issue for us for success and probability of success in clinical trials. And in public health, someone asked a question about Proteus earlier, which we can maybe even discuss. But what's interesting is one of the first early cases of Proteus was transplant rejection. Now, you would think if you've had a bone marrow transplant, you'd be quite sort of incentivized to be taking your anti-rejection meds. People don't. I mean, it's amazing how bad, adherence is both in the clinical practice, and most doctors are in denial about it. So to me, that's the value for me, is that in both cases, this is a really remarkable way to try and improve outcomes, right? Does that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So we travel along the patient's journey from start to finish, and where we're evolving is beyond just an accurate monitoring and intervention system, but can scale to the 6 billion smartphones that will be around the world in the next couple of years. This is really evolving into an intelligent medical assistant that will be able to interact with a patient around a single parameter initially, which is medication adherence, but that parameter has been linked across all therapeutic areas directly to health outcomes.
Thank you. So Asha, maybe you want to start with the questions with Tom?
Yeah, so I guess what we want to do is just to ask some questions more generally to the group and see and get your different kind of perspectives, because it sounds like we've got an assortment of different technologies and perspectives here. So in terms of raising funds, raising capital, raising money, looking at investors, what kind of learning points have you guys had in terms of interacting, raising money, or seeking investment? Can any of you speak to that? Tom, perhaps you can start.
In terms of the mental health in particular, is it?
Yeah, specifically focused on mental. Are there more specific challenges in this area compared to other areas?
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental question when you're looking at both developing a company and investing in a company that I think probably we've all grappled with in some sense. It's breadth versus depth. So I've had a lot of investors ask whether we're going to just own mental health and be the phrase being a full stack solution. So you have psychiatric nurses on staff, you have psychiatrists on staff, you have kind of a coaching model in essence, where you're basically just taking behavioral health or mental health and providing that entire channel of services. Or I think the breadth argument is that is there a kind of attribute that you can bring to care via digital solutions that make certain parts of the system more efficient, and then you can replicate those and scale more rapidly across a few different things. And I think you've got different flavors here.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of Iodine, you actually look at all different types of medicines. It's not like just like antidepressants or antipsychotics. Right. It could be medicines for pain relief, for example.
Right. So we I wouldn't say we do both, but we really see the website as a net that captures a lot of people. So we try to engage with people where the mess starts, which is when they kind of have that medication prescription, and it's kind of a question that comes up before adherence even is this even the right medication for me? How do I know if it's working? And in mental health, that's extremely complicated because it's a symptomatic condition, right?
So Amir had pointed out before that a lot of pharma companies for some time had been a little bit wary about developing medications for mental health indications because the brain is complicated and what are the targets?
They weren't wary in the 80s and 90s. There was a lot of money in it back then,
Yes.
but that pipeline ran out. So I think the hesitation is probably kind of what's
The
next.
low-hanging fruit was gone.
So what we're trying to do is to optimize what exists now. We call it, the inelegant term we use is therapeutic optimization, and that works for mental health because it's particularly messy, but it scales to other conditions. But I think like Lantern is doing some great stuff in kind of owning the problem in a more full stack environment.
Okay, and in terms of other perspectives on this?
One of the things that we've always found is just in digital health and as a whole is especially when you're pitching to traditional VCs in the Valley, the education process on both sides can be a little bit cumbersome. And so, I mean, that was one of the reasons that the partnership with UPMC was so great for us, was that education process was no longer there. And so trying to get people on board and like how the health systems work, what a payer is even, and some of this whole process is potentially a very cumbersome thing when you're pitching to traditional VCs. And so overcoming that gap is one of those things that I'm sure you guys have experienced, just getting that down is really important.
So when you think about mental health or behavioral health, does that make the process harder because people are more wary, or easier because people realize that it's driving healthcare costs for a lot of other medical conditions, and it's been highlighted because of parity and other issues?
I'm not trying to dodge the question by saying both, but it's definitely it all depends on the person you're talking to on the other side of that table. It's like I've seen it go both ways in vast different.
So you're saying it depends how smart they are, basically. Okay.
Yes,
Whether
I like
they
the
get
smart ones.
Yeah, and just to add, I think data helps a lot. One thing that we presented to our venture investors is absolute improvements according to blood concentration levels and the impact of our technology versus with our technology without. And when you can show that in high-risk patient populations like schizophrenia, for example, which is what we did for extended periods of time, such as 6 months, which is again what we did in meaningful numbers, then the data kind of starts to speak to itself, for itself. But you definitely need to identify an educated audience to listen.
And just for the audience, people with schizophrenia, they're some extremely high utilizers of a lot of healthcare services, have a lot of comorbid medical conditions. And in general, a lot of mental health companies or technologies are quite wary of engaging with that population because they are so difficult. So it's great that you're doing that.
It is interesting, both ARQ, I think Proteus, one of the first trials was in schizophrenia, where with that solution, if you think about on face value, you wouldn't think a schizophrenic would wear a patch and swallow a tablet with a chip in it. You'd think the paranoid schizophrenia would be the last place you would go. But actually, if you look at the published papers, it's remarkable how even schizophrenia, they appreciate having feedback on their physiology and what they're doing. It's, they're people that just happen to have schizophrenia as well.
So I was speaking to one of my colleagues the other day, and they thought that one of the reasons for that may be that some of these individuals feel they're being monitored anyway. So this is actually fact. So they feel they're being monitored anyway. So what's an additional little strand of being monitored?
That's funny. Okay.
Corey, did you have any thoughts on raising funds in terms of talking about mental health? Or?
Sure. I mean, I think the killer question in mental health is who pays how much and why. And really, I think mental health is hot if you're pitching to a tech investor because they understand that the population's big and it's a big problem. I think mental health is hard if you're pitching to a biotech investor because it's not hepatitis C or oncology or a rare disease. So I think sort of trying to thread that needle and change your story a little bit depending on who's on the other side of the table is really what it takes. For us, I would say there was probably an additional layer of complexity in that we were coming to investors, asking them to grok that story along with the regulatory layer. And so if you continue to sort of zoom in on the Venn diagram of who understands regulatory risk, who wants to do mental health, and who has some tech capabilities, that's a very, very small sandbox. And so, we very deliberately wound up with a syndicate that does all three, but I think each of the members of our syndicate does one of those aspects quite well.
Who are they?
So 5AM Ventures is one of the members of the syndicate. They're a blue chip biotech investor, have done a bunch of specialty pharma work as well. Jazz Venture Partners is our tech VC, if you will. And then Arboretum Ventures is a best of breed med tech investor, and so they understand scaling medical devices and med tech reimbursement and commercialization. So I think these are hard issues. It's a tough business model, but that's why there's a big opportunity here. And that's why you're not seeing companies sort of step up to do this, because it really takes a cross-functional team and a cross-functional story just to get the resources to be able to build these things.
So is that why you went after this hard problem with basically less competitors are going after it, or why did you choose to go for the hardest thing you could find, basically?
So honestly, I think for digital health, mental health indications are the low-hanging fruit. So I think we're in a space where there's very little pharmaceutical innovation. I think what you see is what you're going to get in terms of the pipeline for the next 10 to 15 years. This is a dangerous place to make a statement like that, but we're not seeing a lot in the way of new mechanisms, new molecules. Basically, we're going to be stuck with the generics. And so if you think about the brain from a basic neuroscience perspective, there are two therapeutic levers. You've got neurochemistry, that's the pill, and you've got cognitive experience, and that's the digital health layer. And we've known for a long, long time that multimodal therapy is where it's at. In depression, study after study, to the point of meta-analyses showing that therapy plus a pill is better than therapy alone, is better than a pill alone. And so if you think about the next next chapter of innovation here, it's all digital.
So you're validating my opening statement. I think digital will have the most impact in behavioral health. Is that what you're basically saying?
Two thumbs up, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
We won't tell the bio people, that's the... Arsha, keep going.
I guess the next question on our list will be, what has been most surprising for you on this journey in terms of developing your companies and going into this space? What has been the most kind of surprising development or finding that you've kind of encountered? Perhaps I'll start.
Always with me. I get no time to think. The most surprising development.
We'll start with that. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things for us was just, when we first started out, we were really worried about reception. Because, the phrase that we've often used was that mental health was kind of the black sheep of healthcare. And we were worried about bringing this idea out into the world and how much was stigma going to hold us down? And how much was the population as a whole ready to focus on mental health and have it be something that we talk about and have panels about and kind of bring to the forefront? And it was a great surprise, but the surprise was that the reception was there, and we are having these things, and it's definitely still slowly getting better, but it was much better than I was expecting it to be when we first started out.
Stigma from who? So stigma affects everybody.
Stigma from everyone across the board. I mean, how hard was it going to be to raise? To your original question, were we going to hire people? Were there enough people out there that wanted to work for a mental health company? Were hospitals and employers going to end up being interested in this kind of product? And so where was the stigma going to pop up? We weren't quite sure, but we kind of were expecting it to be much more of a thing than it ended up.
And that employer space is an area that you're gaining some traction in, right?
Yeah. So we're trying to go into different employers and say, there's a population here that could use services like Lantern, and it's the needle is starting to move in that space as well.
I have an answer actually now. I guess the surprise or vindication for us was that, so we came to this problem with mental health and depression medications in particular because of consumers, because people were really telling us that they had this problem. They had a problem evaluating success and failure, and they had a problem with the trial and error and kind of the cross your fingers approach that conventional medical paradigm. So we knew there was a consumer need, but what I think was a surprise or kind of a relief is how well that consumer need around medication trial and error aligns with the provider need and the payer need. And then, because all of those people are kind of vulnerable to the same problem. So if the patients are out there not being treated, the providers are really not providing the care that they need, and they know that mental health in particular is a issue, and 80% of these antidepressants are being prescribed by primary care doctors. So it's just not well managed at all. Payers are on the hook for when the patients aren't well managed. These are the most expensive patients. So depression is about 10% of the population, but about 25% of the cost, just in ballpark figures. And then put on top of that the kind of regulatory shifts, the tailwinds of reimbursement codes coming in that incentivize psychological monitoring via computer. Put in the move with the CMS and the STAR ratings, the HEDIS measures that will require capturing of PHQ-9 scores, which is the clinical measure of depression, and putting money on the table for providers and payers alike. All of those things are, in essence, kind of addressing the same problem for us. And so for us, it was a real eye-opener when all those things started to align.
Because I know a lot of technologies are developed, there's concern about how long are consumers going to engage and keep recording. And have you had any surprises or positive reactions there in terms of how people are engaging with, for example, the START app that you have for depression symptom monitoring.
Right, like adherence to the app, so to
Right,
speak,
right.
or retention. Yeah, so that's another area where kind of consumer engagement is a imperative on the kind of consumer tech world, but it's also an imperative on the healthcare world in terms of adherence. So understanding how the two worlds can speak or share the vocabulary and benefit from each other's techniques is, I think, an opportunity. Mental health is hard because these are people who, don't necessarily, they have certain kind of burdens in terms of engaging with technology, engaging with communities, things like that are not as easy in mental health. But we've had, I think, great success in terms of leveraging the various tools and strategies and creating real significant retention.
So Tom, but your website, I don't think you don't need to have ongoing engagement. They come to you when they need you, right?
The website, yeah.
They don't need to come to you every day. They just, if they have a problem, some side effect, they want a report to look at.
Right.
Right, so I don't think for your case, you really necessarily need them engaging with you long term all the time, right?
Certainly on the website, there's kind of a two-step that we do, which is, again, we try to answer the problem where it lives, which is oftentimes people get that medication, they go to Google. And I think one of the core challenges of digital health, if you don't have kind of the doctors prescribing an FDA-approved app, one of the core challenges of digital health is distribution. How do you actually get this into patients' hands?
Yeah.
And every digital health company that is going to be speaking should be wrestling with that challenge.
Yeah.
Lantern obviously has got a nice approach via UPMC and some of these other strategies. Our strategy is go where the consumer is, which is via Google, and then drive them into the programs.
So we've got about 3 minutes left. I know, Adam, you talked about objective data, right? Tom, you have patients giving their sort of feedback on side effects. So we've gone from, in the research world, from clinician kind of ratings to patient ratings, trusting that maybe that's okay. What do you all see in the next 5-10 years? How's the horizon looking? So is Apple right that they're going to maybe assess your cognition, just your phone is going to actually in your pocket assess your cognition without you having to do anything? It's completely passive. Is that the future? Or what do you guys each think in the next couple of years? What is the next horizon for really assessing patients, helping to improve outcomes? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I'll keep this brief, but I think sensors are great. Passive data is wonderful and has a lot of value, but there is a lot to be gained from asking people what is their experience.
Absolutely.
Active data is incredibly powerful, especially when it comes to mental health, when these are subjective, oftentimes very subjective experiences. There's no lab test, there's no blood test for most mental health conditions. So having a real, authentic rapport with people and getting useful information back, oftentimes that's benchmarked on clinically validated kind of measures like the PHQ-9. That's an essential part, I think, of a successful mental health solution.
Anyone else have thoughts about the future? Go ahead, Dan.
So at AICure, as I mentioned, we're trying to fill this continuity of care gap by developing and deploying an intelligent medical assistant with the aim of changing behavior. And I recently read in this Goldman Sachs equity analyst report that he broke down different segments of digital health, but he couldn't quantify the size of the impact that behavior modification would have in the market because the number was so large. And at the end of the day, I think economics will drive how successful different approaches will be.
Any other comments from anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're definitely going to see a tech-enabled layer around mental health diagnosis and treatment. So if you think about the way that depression is diagnosed today, for example, sleep behavior and locomotor behavior are two of the main aspects of a depression diagnosis. There's no reason that patient self-report should be able to do that better than smartphone tracking of sleep and locomotor behavior. So I think there will be no end surrogate for patient self-report, but you're going to see more and more of these data collection layers finding their way into existing clinical paradigms.
Great. So to finish off, the first thing I noticed, although it's dark in the room, I did notice in the audience not a single person that I could see was on their phone. So that tells me that you were listening and you were engaged. I'm really grateful about that. Obviously, our speakers were fantastic to enable us to do that. Arsha, do you have any closing comments?
I think it's just to reiterate what you were saying, that mental health is important, but it also cuts across all of these other medical conditions, and it drives so much of our healthcare costs. And that the data science and these technologies are going to help us to really reconceptualize the way that we diagnose, monitor, treat, and then it's going to loop back around and help us to redefine, I think, some of these conditions.
Great. I'd like to thank our speakers today. Great panel. Thank you.
Thank you.